Okay, so then to some more complexities in how this credibility economy is functioning. Um, and we'll also talk a little bit more about the connections to questions of the use of experts, which ones we should trust, state authority, does the state have authority, science and democracy. So the issues that have been occupying us for the last weeks. Okay. So this is what we're talking about now is what's discussed in this article by Gloria Origgi. So she has some really fantastic examples. I'm only going to talk about very few of them. So if you haven't read her article, just read it also for some really thought-provoking and interesting examples that really get you to think about a number of different things. So one example is this example. You read on a cigarette pack. I don't think that's true in Norway, where it says smoking kills. I think in Norway it's blacked out. The whole cigarette pack. Now, okay, here's a question. How do you know that what it says on the package is true? I mean, that it's true that smoking kills. How do you know that? If you like many people, I think a little bit about it. How do you know that smoking causes cancer and then people die from it, or kills through other ways too? How do you know that? Okay. So what Origgi observes is that most people haven't really read any scientific evidence about this. Indeed, they haven't really read anywhere else about it much. They basically just seen it on cigarette packs. But then how do you know that that's true? So she used that to describe how complicated that really, the interpretation of that is. Why do you think it's true? Why do you think, for instance, why do you think it's true? And she argues that plausibly, it's because you think a bit like this. The company of the packaging tries to sell cigarettes. They wouldn't put a sign that says that their product kills on the product deliberately. That would be very bad. So you think that cannot possibly be that they put it themselves, because that's just so stupid. So someone else must have put it. Who has the power to put things on packages? Well, really, it's only state authorities. So you think, well, I live in a country where that kind of really, the state has the power to put signs like that on packaging. So it's got to have been the state. And I live in a society like Norway, like France, where I think Origgi works, where the state is decently trustworthy. And so I think if the state goes through the effort of putting it on every single cigarette package, they have to have pretty decent evidence. And also I think, well, if they didn't have any evidence for this, they could not possibly force the cigarette companies to put it there. They would have went to court and sued them, for example, if they say something that's wrong. So you think, well, the state really is the only place that has authority, and they really have that authority also only if is very likely true. So then you think it must almost certainly be true if it's on the package. So this just shows how complicated that is, how we come to know something or come to believe that something is true on the basis of some testimony, like in this case, reading this. Okay, it has to do with basic beliefs about how our state works. Someone who, say, is in a state that's completely dysfunctional, they might not come to believe that it's true because the state says it. Questions about how the relationship between companies and the state, who has power, and so on and so forth. Very, very complicated thoughts that basically go into this. She has a similar example about the landing on the moon. How do you know that this actually happened. You know, you know, there are people who don't think it happened, but why do you think it happened? Why do you think these pictures have not been faked? And she gives some, I'm not going to go through this now in as much detail. She gives some very nice example there too, how you know, your belief that this happened has to do with things about, you know, you basically might trust the US government that they wouldn't stage this. You might think that there was also big interest, like in the Russians, to discover it, so they would have discovered it if it was faked. That you think it's really not so easy to fake well. There were like thousands of people working on this. For them, would have been they would have made so much money by coming out about this. They would never have done this anyway. Lots and lots of reasons you might have that shows really quite complicated why you think it's true, given that the evidence you might have is very limited, actually. So these examples illustrate how trust in basic democratic systems, basic knowledge about how the world works, in many ways play a role in assigning credibility to particular utterances. Okay? So it's not just about taking some person to having prejudice or not prejudice against a person. There's a lot of complex interpretational issues that are happening when we assign credibility to a particular utterance. So then how do we assign trust, whether a particular utterance, someone says is trustworthy, and how do we do that, and how does that maybe open for new possibilities, different possibilities for injustice? So Origgi thinks that prejudice is not the only way information exchange can be distorted, and she describes several other influences in the credibility economy. And I'm going to describe them. Sometimes we're going to mention how that could potentially lead to distortions, but there's going to be a lot of invitations to you thinking, how can that be sort of distorted and cause injustices to particular people? Okay, so what makes us trust a particular apparent piece of information? Okay. So one thing is that we're trying to judge whether the person we're talking to is in fact reliable generally. Okay. So we might, for example, want to just have relevant information. So, you know, if you ask me about the weather in the south of the United States, you will not, you are right to think that I'm very unlikely that I have relevant information because I'm not there, I've never been there. But then, of course, also you use issues about what kind of person is she? Is a rich or poor person? What's the social political background? These are things that we are using to judge whether that person is likely reliable, and we're doing that all the time. We're thinking also about the past track record. Is this a person that has lied before, has been unreliable before, that they have said things that weren't true, or has she been mostly correct? There's also, I mean, so this can, of course, these issues can be a source of testimonial injustice. Okay, so the issue that we have a prejudice against a certain kind of person and thereby lower their credibility, that's what testimonial injustice was on Fricke's way of thinking. There are, I think, other ways in which this can happen here, and injustices can happen. I invite you to think about that. For example, what does it mean to have access to information? Arguably, that Origgi brings out, arguably there's a more fundamental, there's a sort of error here that's called the fundamental attribution error in psychology that is also at play, where we take as more important what kind of person someone is. So what a person does, that is, for example, says someone does, is attributed to the character of the person instead of the situation she finds herself in. So this might be explaining why we use this sort of these character assignments to interpret whether they are reliable, rather than thinking actually about the situation they're in. We're also going to use, when we interpret what someone says, the kind of content they are giving to us. Is this the sort of thing that's likely true? Because that can be a source of problem too, because when we think about what sort of things are likely true, there is a phenomenon that's known as confirmation bias. That is the bias where we tend to believe something more if it confirms what we already believe. So we'd love to believe things that that confirm what we're already thinking. I invite you to think about examples of that. And so there can be a certain bias when it comes to assessing whether the content is reliable. What else do we use when we assign trust to particular sources? One thing is that we use authority as often unquestioned and long forgotten. So give personal examples here. I tend to interpret news about organic food and even homeopathy with fairly high level of trust. I have to force myself not to trust that this is healthy or has something to it. And with homeopathy, I've gone through long kind of complicated ways of finding out why is this made. Maybe there is something to it. What could be the mechanism? Why is that? Well, I grew up in a household where that was using those sort of organic food and using those globally was just part of our daily lives. And I almost forgotten that that's happening, but it's still influencing me. And that's true, I think, for all of us. Often what we assign trust has to do with a particular way we, for example, grew up and what some authority figures like parents said early in our lives, and we have almost forgotten about it. We also use reputation to assign trust to an utterance. Does this person have a good reputation on these matters? No, not reputation. It's not about popularity. Reputation isn't really about whether they are actually reliable. It's about, what do others say about them? Do they have a good reputation? And we use that a lot. I mean, we find experts. So there's a famous coronavirus expert, Drosten, who has a good reputation. Okay? And we use that to interpret what they say with a lot of trust. Now, one problem here that Origgi mentions is the so-called Matthew effect. It's an effect that where someone who has already good reputation, they get more attention and hence more reputation. So reputation feeds reputation. They tend to so someone who's like Drosten in a sort of have, for some reason or other, he deserves his reputation, but he gets more by now being on television and so on a lot. Actually, sorry, he has actually stopped that a little bit, but anyway, you kind of hope you just sort of get this. Another thing that Origgi thinks we use is robust signals. So these are signs of reliability that are very hard to fake or that are costly. So, for example, it's if someone publishes a paper in a top journal like Nature, that is normally a good sign because it's very hard to fake that. I mean, it's very hard to, bullshit or to write something wrong in a top journal like Nature because there are a lot of mechanisms to prevent it. So we take that then to be a sign that's probably reliable because it's a pretty good signal. It's really hard to fake. But we also use other things like emotional signals. If you meet someone who has a cat like that, how could you not trust them? I mean, they must be true. I mean, they have a cute cat like that. So we certainly use those things as well. Origgi thinks that someone who just feels right. And then finally, she mentioned moral commitments. So sometimes we feel that we owe trust to someone For example, because they have trusted us. And here I want to mention injustice that can happen here. And that's sort of old boys networks, where you feel, or you, a person in the network feels that they owe trust to another person network because they have trusted them 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So these networks where you incur various moral commitments that where one person has trusted you, so now you must trust them, then they have this level of trust inside, but someone else might not get into that because no one is committed to trusting them. No one owes them anything. And so that's very hard to get in. So there can be injustice there. Okay, that's the end. So what I mentioned now here is several, a whole other range of sort of heuristics we use to assign trust to particular utterance. And what I invite you to, and I write that in on Canvas, is to think about ways in which these processes can be distorted so that they lead to new forms of epistemic injustice that are maybe not discussed by Fricke. Good. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you on Zoom or enjoy the lecture.